The air in Asheville, North Carolina, carried that peculiar stillness that comes after a funeral, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like even the wind is paying its respects. Margaret Hayes, 67 years old, sat alone in the living room of the home she had shared with her husband, Daniel, for more than 4 decades. The flowers from the memorial were still fresh on the dining table, their fragrance clinging to the house like a ghost. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. Daniel had been gone only 6 weeks. Heart failure, sudden and merciless. Margaret had barely begun to navigate her grief when the people she should have been able to lean on, her own daughter Emily and son-in-law David, decided it was time to rip the ground from under her. That evening, without warning, Emily and David arrived at the house. They didn't come with casseroles or comforting words. They came with 2 rolling suitcases and expressions that looked more like business than compassion. Emily, dressed sharply as always, leaned against the doorway, her arms crossed in a way that reminded Margaret of Daniel's stubborn posture when he was set on something. But Emily's eyes were colder, sharper. David stood just behind her, phone in hand, his tie loosened like he'd stepped out of the bank and straight into this confrontation. "Mom," Emily began, her voice rehearsed, each word clipped. "We've talked this over. It's not healthy for you to stay here. This house is too big, too much for you to handle. Dad wouldn't want you struggling alone." Margaret blinked at her daughter, confusion rippling across her face. "Emily, I've lived here for 43 years. I raised you in these walls. Every inch of this home has Daniel's touch. Emily cut her off with a sigh so sharp it could slice paper. "That's exactly the problem. You're clinging to the past. You're useless now, Mom. It's time for you to find somewhere else, somewhere you can live out your days quietly, maybe a senior place in town." The word useless landed like a blow. Margaret felt her chest tighten, her breath catching as though the air itself had betrayed her. She searched Emily's face for some sign of regret, some flicker of daughterly love, but found only calculation. David, sensing the silence was stretching too long, cleared his throat and spoke in the soothing tone he probably used with anxious clients at the bank. "Margaret, you'll be happier in a community with people your age. No more worries about maintenance or bills. Think of it as independence." Independence. Margaret almost laughed. How could they dress cruelty in such polite clothing? Her mind raced. For decades, she had been the anchor of this family, the one who kept the home clean, the meals cooked, the traditions alive. She had sacrificed her own dreams so Emily could go to college, so Daniel could pursue his career without distraction. And now her only child stood in front of her, dismissing 43 years of sacrifice with 2 words: "You're useless." She felt her throat burn, but no tears came, not yet. Instead, she nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she pressed them together in her lap. "If that's what you want, Emily," she whispered. Emily didn't flinch. "It's what's best for everyone." For everyone. Except Margaret. An hour later, Margaret stood in her bedroom, staring at the open closet. Dresses, sweaters, Daniel's old flannel shirts she had never found the strength to give away, they all seemed to lean toward her, as if begging her not to go. But she knew she couldn't stay. Her fingers moved automatically, folding blouses, stacking skirts, slipping photo frames into the side pocket of a suitcase. The zipper closed with a sound that seemed to echo through the empty house. One suitcase, then another. 43 years of marriage, motherhood, and memory reduced to 2 battered bags and a shoebox of photographs. Downstairs, Emily glanced at her watch, tapping her heel impatiently on the hardwood floor. David busied himself by loading the suitcases into the back of their SUV, efficient and detached. To them, this wasn't tragedy, it was transaction. Margaret took one last look around the living room, the worn recliner where Daniel used to read the paper, the floral curtains she had sewn herself, the faint indent in the carpet where the Christmas tree always stood. Every detail felt alive, whispering, This is your home. But it wasn't hers anymore, not in their eyes. She tightened her grip on the shoebox and walked out the door, the late autumn chill biting her cheeks. As she climbed into the car, Emily's perfume filled the small space, an expensive scent that clashed with the stale air of betrayal. No words were exchanged on the drive. Only the quiet hum of tires on asphalt and the sound of Margaret's heart breaking in silence. She sat in the back seat, her gaze fixed on the rear window. The house, their house, her house grew smaller and smaller until it was nothing more than a blur swallowed by the horizon. In that moment, Margaret understood something she had never wanted to face. Sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from strangers, but from the very people you once would have died to protect. And yet, somewhere inside that pain, a spark flickered, a whisper of defiance. This wasn't the end of her story. Not yet. Stay until the end, and then comment to let me know, have you ever witnessed a story like this in real life? The next morning should have been quiet. Margaret had imagined making coffee in Daniel's favorite mug, maybe watering the roses he had planted out front. Instead, she found herself cornered in her own kitchen by her daughter and son-in-law. Emily laid a stack of papers across the counter like a dealer in a high-stakes card game. She didn't look at her mother when she spoke. It's official now. Everything Dad left behind is mine. The house, the investments, all of it. He trusted me to carry on his legacy. Margaret's voice trembled as she reached for the documents. That can't be right. Your father showed me his will years ago. He said I'd be provided for. David, ever the smooth banker, stepped in before Emily could reply. Margaret, wills can change. Daniel probably updated things before he passed. He must have known Emily could handle the finances better than you. It's nothing personal, just practicality. Nothing personal. Margaret felt her hands go cold. Was this what her life had been reduced to, a line item, a liability? Emily's lips curled into something between pity and impatience. Honestly, Mom, it's a kindness that we've let you stay here this long, but it's time. This house is ours now, and we're moving in today. Margaret staggered back a step, her chest heaving. She had spent decades polishing these floors, repainting these walls, filling this space with laughter and love. How could her own daughter stand there and erase it all with a sentence? Emily, she whispered, this is my home. Her daughter's eyes flickered, the mask slipping for just a moment. Beneath the cool tone was something sharper: greed, triumph. No, Mother, it was your home. Now it's mine. The words cut deeper than any knife. David pulled 2 crisp bills from his wallet, sliding them across the counter like he was tipping a waitress. Here, $200 should cover a few nights somewhere while you get settled. We'll transfer more later once everything's sorted. Margaret stared at the money, her face flushing with shame. 43 years of loyalty, of sacrifice, of love, reduced to 2 green bills, tossed like scraps. She didn't argue. She couldn't. The weight of betrayal pressed too heavy on her chest. Instead, she moved quietly, obediently, just as she always had. She zipped her bags, tucked away the shoebox of photographs, and followed them outside. The SUV idled in the driveway, its polished black paint gleaming under the morning sun. David loaded her suitcases in the back, his movements brisk, efficient, as though he were discarding garbage rather than uprooting a life. Margaret slid into the back seat. The leather was cold against her skin. Emily settled in front, scrolling through her phone, while David adjusted the mirror and pulled onto the street. For a long time, no one spoke. Only the rhythmic hum of tires on pavement filled the silence. Margaret's gaze drifted to the window. Her house stood tall at the end of the street, the shutters freshly painted, the oak tree Daniel had planted swaying in the wind. She saw flashes of memory: Emily's 10th birthday party with balloons tied to the porch railing, Daniel's laughter echoing as he grilled hamburgers in the backyard, the soft glow of Christmas lights twinkling against freshly fallen snow. All of it blurred together as the car rolled farther away. The house grew smaller, shrinking into the distance, until it was nothing but a smudge swallowed by the horizon. Margaret pressed her forehead against the glass, her breath fogging the window. It felt like watching her entire life vanish in the rearview mirror, piece by piece. She thought of the nights she had stayed awake nursing Emily through fevers, the mornings she had packed lunches, the countless times she had set her own needs aside so her family could thrive. Now, the very child she had once rocked to sleep was tossing her into the cold with nothing but 2 suitcases and a handful of dollars. Her chest ached with a grief that went beyond losing Daniel. This was worse. This was the death of trust, of motherhood as she had known it. Emily glanced back once, her eyes meeting Margaret's through the mirror. There was no apology there, no flicker of regret, only a steely determination, as though this was business and nothing more. Margaret turned back to the window, swallowing the bitterness rising in her throat. She refused to let them see her break. Not yet. As the SUV carried her farther from the home she had built, she tightened her grip on the shoebox in her lap. Inside were old photographs her wedding day, Emily's first steps, Daniel's proud smile when he finished building the deck. Tiny fragments of a life that could not be stripped away by signatures on paper. The house was gone. The fortune was gone. But somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a story no one, not even Emily and David, could have predicted. And as the last glimpse of her home disappeared behind the trees, Margaret's tears finally fell quiet, hot, and resolute. The Blue Ridge Motel sat on the outskirts of town, wedged between a gas station and a shuttered diner whose neon sign still buzzed faintly, refusing to die. Its paint was peeling, its parking lot cracked with weeds, and its rooms rented by the week to truckers, drifters, and the forgotten. Margaret had never imagined herself in a place like this. But that night, after Emily and David dropped her off with nothing but $200 and 2 suitcases, she found herself unlocking room 7 with a key attached to a plastic tag, the numbers scrawled in fading ink. The room greeted her with a smell of damp carpet and stale cigarettes, though the sign outside proudly declared non-smoking. The bedspread was a faded floral print, stiff as cardboard, the sheets underneath thin and gray with age. A single bulb buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The springs groaned beneath her weight. For 43 years, she had fallen asleep in the same bed beside her husband, Daniel, his steady breathing a comfort even in the darkest nights. Now she sat alone in a motel room where the silence felt like a punishment. She ran her fingers across the threadbare blanket, shuddering at its damp chill. This wasn't home. This wasn't even shelter. It was a holding cell, a limbo for the unwanted. On the nightstand stood a crooked lamp and a Bible with its cover torn, as though it had been opened in desperation too many times. Margaret reached for it, then let her hand fall. She didn't need scripture to tell her what she already knew. Her own daughter had cast her aside like garbage. Her mind replayed the words Emily had spoken. "You're useless now. Find somewhere else to die." The cruelty rang louder in this room than it had in the house. Each syllable echoed in her ears, crueler than the sound of Daniel's coffin being lowered into the earth. Margaret closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember who she had once been. Not the grieving widow, not the discarded mother, but the woman who had once dreamed of becoming an artist before marriage and motherhood consumed her days. She remembered her first canvas, the smell of oil paints, the way Daniel had smiled when she showed him her work. "You've got a gift, Maggie," he had said, kissing her forehead. But then bills piled up, Emily was born, and the easel in the corner gathered dust. She traded brushes for spatulas, paint for laundry baskets. She had told herself it was worth every sacrifice to raise Emily in a stable home, to give her daughter everything Margaret never had. And now that same daughter had stolen the very roof over her head. Tears blurred her vision, hot and relentless. She pressed her fists to her eyes, shaking with a grief that was bigger than death itself. Death had taken her husband, but betrayal had taken her dignity. Outside, headlights swept across the thin curtains as a car pulled into the lot, then faded. Somewhere down the hall, a couple argued, their voices muffled but sharp. The thin walls made it impossible to hide from the world's noise, but inside, Margaret's world had gone utterly silent. She curled onto the mattress, pulling the rough blanket over herself. The springs dug into her back, the damp air clung to her skin, and the musty scent filled her lungs. Sleep didn't come. Instead, memories did. Emily's laughter as a child, Daniel's strong arms lifting their daughter onto his shoulders. Family dinners where Margaret sat back quietly, letting father and daughter shine while she kept the dishes full and the conversation smooth. She had given them everything, every ounce of energy, every dream deferred, every piece of herself. And now, she had nothing left but a shoebox of photographs at the foot of the bed. The hours crawled. Midnight came and went. Margaret stared at the cracked ceiling, her chest aching with loneliness. And then, in the darkest hour, something shifted. She sat up slowly, her face streaked with tears, her eyes burning not just from sorrow, but from something sharper anger. For decades, she had accepted her place in silence, believing her sacrifices would be honored, her devotion rewarded. But tonight proved otherwise. Silence had earned her nothing. Obedience had bought her exile. Margaret Hayes pressed her palms against her knees and whispered into the gloom, "I will not end my life like this. I will not be thrown away." Her voice cracked, but her words held weight. In that dingy motel room, beneath the buzzing light and the mildew-scented sheets, Margaret made a vow. She would not be erased, she would not be forgotten. And she would not be powerless again. The night stretched on, but Margaret no longer lay defeated. She sat upright, watching the horizon through the thin curtains, waiting for dawn. Somewhere inside, the woman who had once buried her dreams was stirring again. The motel room hadn't destroyed her, it had awakened her. Morning sunlight filtered through the grimy curtains of the Blue Ridge Motel, cutting across Margaret's face like a blade. She hadn't slept more than a few hours. Her vow from the night before still burned inside her. If Daniel had trusted her with anything in their 43 years together, it was the promise that she'd be provided for. He had always been meticulous, every bill paid on time, every account carefully balanced. The man who had labeled folders in their attic storage boxes would never leave his wife destitute. Clutching the last $20 bill from Emily's so-called kindness, Margaret boarded the city bus to downtown Asheville. Her destination was the familiar red brick building on College Street, the office of Richard O'Connor, the attorney who had handled the Hayes family's legal matters for decades. Her heart pounded as she stepped through the heavy oak door. The waiting room smelled faintly of leather and old paper. Behind the reception desk sat a young secretary who looked up with surprise. "Mrs. Hayes, Mr. O'Connor has been expecting you." Margaret frowned. Expecting her? Moments later, she was led into a corner office lined with shelves of legal tomes and framed photographs. Richard O'Connor rose from behind his desk, his tall frame slightly stooped with age, his silver hair combed neatly back. His face softened as soon as he saw her. "Margaret," he said warmly, crossing the room to take her hand. "I've been trying to reach you. I called the house several times. Your daughter told me you were traveling, too distraught to handle legal matters." Margaret blinked in confusion. "Traveling?" "Richard, I've been in Asheville the entire time. Emily never said anything about a will or a reading." Richard's kind eyes narrowed with concern. "She didn't tell you?" He shook his head, visibly unsettled. "There was a reading of Daniel's will 3 weeks ago. Emily attended. I gave her copies of the document and assumed she had shared everything with you." Margaret's breath caught. "No, she told me. She told me everything belonged to her. That Daniel left me nothing." Richard's expression hardened, lines deepening across his brow. He moved swiftly to a large file cabinet, pulling out a thick folder stamped Hayes Estate. Opening it on the desk, he slid a document toward Margaret. "Your husband updated his will 6 months before his passing. He wanted to ensure your security. You were meant to be the first to know." Margaret's hands trembled as she picked up the paper. She recognized Daniel's precise handwriting on the signature line, the ink bold and certain. Richard began to read aloud, his voice steady. "I, Daniel Joseph Hayes, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath to my beloved wife, Margaret Ann Hayes, the following. Our primary residence at 217 Willow Lane, including all furnishings and personal effects. Additionally, I leave her 70% of all financial assets, investments, and accounts, totaling approximately $23 million. Margaret gasped. $23 million. The house. 70% of everything. Her knees felt weak, and she gripped the arms of the leather chair to steady herself. Richard continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. To my daughter, Emily Hayes Parker, I leave $10 million to be held in trust with distributions beginning on her 45th birthday. This inheritance is contingent upon her treatment of her mother following my death. Should she fail to treat Margaret Hayes with respect and dignity, her inheritance shall revert in its entirety to Margaret Hayes. The room spun around her. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, her heart racing. Daniel had known. Somehow, he had anticipated what Emily might try to do. He had written protection into the very fabric of his final wishes. Her voice shook as she looked up at Richard. She lied. Emily told me Daniel left me nothing. She moved me out of the house. She gave me $200 as though I were some charity case. Richard's face darkened, his normally calm demeanor edged with anger. What your daughter has done is fraud, elder abuse. She deliberately concealed the will and misrepresented its contents. That alone could have serious legal consequences for her. Margaret sank back in her chair, the weight of the revelation both crushing and liberating. She hadn't been abandoned. She hadn't been forgotten. Daniel, in his quiet, deliberate way, had made sure she was protected even from their own daughter. For the first time in weeks, tears slid down her cheeks, not from despair but from relief. He still took care of me, she whispered, even after death. Richard leaned forward, his eyes steady on hers. Margaret, you are not powerless. You are not penniless. Everything Emily thought she controlled actually belongs to you. Every account, every investment, and the house itself. And because of her actions, her $10 million is now yours as well. Margaret's breath caught. All of it? You mean, I inherit $33 million? Yes, Richard said firmly. $33 million, the house and everything in it. Your daughter has cost herself everything. A silence filled the room, heavy but electric. Margaret felt something ignite inside her chest, a spark that had been smothered by grief and betrayal. Emily thought she had stripped her mother of everything. But in her arrogance, she had triggered the very clause that ensured Margaret's security. The pawn had become the queen. Margaret straightened in her chair, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer broken, it carried steel. Richard, tell me what I need to do next. Richard nodded approvingly. First, we secure the assets. Then, we let Emily know the truth. She's about to discover just how wrong she was. Margaret's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. It wasn't joy. It wasn't revenge. It was something deeper. The rediscovery of her own strength. The motel room, the cruel dismissal, the humiliation, all of it had led her here, to this moment of clarity. Daniel had prepared the way. Now it was Margaret's turn to step into it. The walk back to the Blue Ridge Motel felt different that day. Margaret still carried her 2 battered suitcases, still wore the same faded coat, still had the weight of grief pressing on her shoulders, but inside, something had shifted. For the first time since Daniel's death, she was no longer stumbling in the dark. She had truth, and truth, she realized, was power. When she stepped into room 7, Richard was already on the phone. He had insisted on driving her back, refusing to let her ride the bus again. His voice carried an energy she hadn't heard before, sharp and precise as he spoke to the district attorney's office, then the local police. Forgery, concealment of a legal document, elder abuse. Yes, I'll fax over the original and certified copies tonight. He glanced at Margaret, gave her a small, reassuring nod, then turned back to the call. Freeze every account under Emily Hayes Parker's name until further notice. All assets are to be locked pending verification. Margaret lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, the same sagging mattress that had nearly broken her the night before. Now it felt like neutral ground in a battle she hadn't even realized she was fighting. The hum of the air conditioner mixed with Richard's steady commands. Each word fraud, felony, seizure, investigation sounded like bricks being laid in a wall of justice, each one building higher between her and the daughter who had betrayed her. Finally, Richard ended the call. He set the receiver down with deliberate calm, then turned to her. "It's begun. By tonight, Emily and David won't be able to touch a dime. Their credit cards will decline. Their utilities, their mortgage, everything they thought they controlled will start slipping away." Margaret's lips trembled. Not with fear, but with something new: vindication. She thought of Emily sitting smugly in her living room, probably making plans to remodel Daniel's study or host a dinner party to show off her new fortune. How would her daughter react when the rug was pulled out from under her? The answer came sooner than Margaret expected. At 4:17 p.m., the phone in the motel room rang. Richard answered first, his voice firm. "O'Connor and Hayes Legal." He listened for a moment, then handed the receiver to Margaret. "It's her." Margaret's hand shook as she lifted the phone. For a moment she said nothing, listening to the sound of her daughter's voice, sharper now, tinged with panic. "Mom, where are you? Something's wrong with the bank accounts. The cards aren't working. They're saying everything is frozen. Did you do something?" Margaret inhaled slowly, steadying her breath. She thought about the shoebox of photographs at her feet, about Daniel's quiet handwriting on the will, about 43 years of sacrifice dismissed with the words, "You're useless now." When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost too calm. "Hello, Emily. I'm at Richard O'Connor's office. Do you remember him? Daddy's attorney? The one who read the real will?" A beat of silence. Then Emily's voice, higher, tighter. "The real will? I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but you do." Margaret leaned forward, her hand gripping the phone tighter. "The one where your father left me 70% of everything. The house, the accounts, $23 million. Do you recall that, Emily? Or were you too busy forging documents to notice?" On the other end of the line, Margaret could hear her daughter's breathing quicken. The mask of control was cracking. "That's impossible," Emily snapped. "Dad trusted me. He knew you couldn't handle money." He told me." Margaret cut her off, her tone sharper than she had ever dared use before. "Your father knew exactly what you were. That's why he added a clause. $10 million, contingent on how you treated me. And do you know what, Emily? You've already lost it. Every last cent. By throwing me out, by lying, by telling me to die, you handed it all to me." The line went quiet. So quiet Margaret could hear the faint hum of static. Then suddenly, Emily's voice erupted, frantic and trembling. "No, that's not fair. You don't know how complicated this is. You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." Margaret's voice was cold now, steel wrapped in sorrow. "You thought I was weak. You thought I wouldn't question you. You believed I'd die quietly while you spent the fortune your father built. But you were wrong. And now, you have nothing." A muffled sound came through the line, perhaps a sob, perhaps a scream. Margaret couldn't tell, and she realized she didn't care. For decades, she had been the obedient wife, the quiet mother, the woman who never raised her voice. But at that moment, in a cheap motel room with peeling wallpaper, she felt taller than she ever had in her own home. Emily tried again, her words tumbling out too quickly. "Mom, listen, we can fix this. Maybe if you tell them you misunderstood, if you sign something." Margaret closed her eyes, picturing Daniel's signature on the will, steady and final. "No, Emily, I won't lie for you. You made your choices. Now you'll face the consequences." Her daughter's voice broke completely. "Mom, please don't do this. Don't take everything from me." Margaret's hand tightened on the receiver. For a moment, the old instinct stirred the mother's reflex to comfort, to protect, to forgive. But then she remembered standing on the porch as Emily told her to find somewhere else to die. Margaret let the silence stretch until it was unbearable. Then she spoke, each word deliberate. "I'm not taking anything from you, Emily. You gave it away yourself." And with that, she placed the receiver back on the cradle. The room was still. Richard studied her quietly, as though seeing her for the first time. "Well," he said softly, "I'd say the Queen has entered the board." Margaret exhaled, her shoulders trembling, but not with weakness. This time, it was release, the weight of decades sliding away. She wasn't the pawn anymore. She was the Queen. The motel room grew smaller with each passing day. Margaret sat at the chipped desk, papers spread across the surface like a map of a world she had never known. Richard had delivered copies of Daniel's files, bank statements, business contracts, records of consulting fees. To most eyes, they looked like ordinary documents, but to Margaret, they whispered of secrets. She traced her fingers across the signatures, the notations in Daniel's handwriting. For years, she had trusted him implicitly, never questioning his meticulous habits. Bills were always paid, taxes always filed, vacations budgeted to the last penny. Daniel had been the architect of their financial stability. Yet here, in black and white, was a pattern she couldn't ignore. Payments to shell companies she'd never heard of. Transfers to accounts in Miami, Las Vegas, even overseas. Consulting fees from corporations that, upon closer inspection, didn't exist. Her chest tightened as she whispered into the empty room. "Daniel, what did you do?" The betrayal felt sharp, almost unbearable. Had she been living with a stranger all along? While she cooked his meals, ironed his shirts, and held his hand at night, had he been laundering money behind her back? Her stomach churned. For a moment, Margaret thought she might be sick. The man she had trusted more than anyone, the man she had defended to Emily countless times, was now revealed as a criminal. She pushed back from the desk, pacing the room. Memories collided in her mind. Daniel laughing as he planted the oak tree in the yard. Daniel surprising her with flowers on their anniversary. Daniel's eyes soft with worry when her mother died. Could all of that have been a mask? The knock on the door startled her. Richard entered with a woman in her 40s, her dark hair pulled into a sharp bun, her suit crisp. She carried herself with an air of quiet authority. "Margaret," Richard said, "this is Special Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI. She's here because what you found isn't the whole story." The woman extended her hand. Margaret hesitated before shaking it, her palm clammy. "Mrs. Hayes," Agent Martinez said gently, "I know this is overwhelming. But I need you to understand something important about your husband." Margaret sank back onto the bed, clutching a pillow against her chest. "Overwhelming? I just discovered Daniel was laundering money. Everything I thought I knew about him, it's gone." Agent Martinez's expression softened. "You're half right. Your husband was involved in money laundering, but not for himself. For us." Margaret blinked, confused. "For you?" The agent nodded. "For the FBI. Daniel Hayes was an undercover informant. For 12 years, he worked with us to infiltrate a major organized crime network. He maintained the appearance of laundering money so he could feed us information, names, dates, accounts. Thanks to him, we've already secured over 40 arrests and dismantled multiple criminal fronts." The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Margaret shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. No, you don't understand. He was a banker, not a spy." "He was my husband. He was both," Martinez said firmly. "Your husband lived a double life, not because he wanted to deceive you, but because secrecy was the only way to protect you. If the truth had leaked, you could have been in danger. And now, Mrs. Hayes, because of his work, your inheritance is not tainted. It is protected under federal law. Every dollar you've received is legally yours." Margaret covered her mouth with trembling hands. Relief and grief battled inside her chest. For days, she had believed Daniel had betrayed her memory, their marriage, everything they had built. And now, the truth shattered that illusion. He hadn't betrayed her at all. He had saved her. Her voice cracked. So all those late nights at the office, all the unexplained trips, he wasn't hiding an affair, he wasn't chasing money for himself, he was protecting me. Agent Martinez nodded. Protecting you, protecting your future. In fact, his final update to the will 6 months before his death was made with our knowledge. He wanted to make sure that if anything happened to him, you would be safe, financially, legally, personally. Margaret's tears spilled over now, hot and unstoppable. She pressed the pillow to her face to muffle the sobs that tore out of her. The relief was crushing, the love she thought she'd lost suddenly flooding back like a tidal wave. Daniel hadn't been a stranger, he had been a guardian. When she finally lowered the pillow, her eyes were red, but her voice carried a strength that hadn't been there before. He knew Emily. He knew she would turn on me. Richard nodded solemnly. Yes, that's why he built in the clause. He saw her entitlement, her greed, her disregard. He didn't want her cruelty to destroy you after he was gone. Margaret closed her eyes, Daniel's face clear in her mind. She remembered his last words to her, whispered weakly in the hospital. You'll be fine, Maggie. I've made sure of it. At the time, she had thought it was comfort. Now, she knew it was truth. The grief she had been carrying shifted into something new, gratitude, and a quiet, fierce determination. Daniel had played a long game, one she hadn't even realized. Now it was her turn to finish it. Margaret straightened her shoulders and looked at Agent Martinez. So what happens now? The agent's lips curved into the faintest smile. Now, Mrs. Hayes, you live the life your husband wanted for you. You're not a victim anymore. You're the beneficiary of his courage, and you're the rightful owner of everything Emily thought she had stolen. Margaret inhaled deeply, the weight of betrayal replaced by something steadier. For the first time since Daniel's death, she didn't feel hollow. She felt whole. Her husband had not abandoned her. He had prepared her. The pawn had not just become the queen. The queen had always been there, waiting to step onto the board. By the end of that week, Margaret had learned more about power than she had in her entire life. Power wasn't about shouting or intimidating or even having the biggest bank account. It was about patience, about knowing the truth and waiting for the right moment to use it. Emily and David didn't understand that. They were scrambling. The frozen accounts, the rejected credit cards, the whispers spreading through David's bank, everything they had built their lives around was collapsing. So of course, they came crawling back. It started with a call. Emily's voice, trembling, edged with desperation. Mom, can we meet? Please, this has gotten out of hand. We can work something out. You don't want this fight. Neither of us do. Margaret, sitting across from Agent Sarah Martinez in Richard O'Connor's office, pressed the phone to her ear and listened in silence. Once, those words would have melted her. Once, she would have bent over backward to soothe her daughter's panic. But not anymore. What exactly are you proposing, Emily? She asked, her voice steady. David's baritone slipped onto the line, smoother, rehearsed. 5 million. We've spoken to attorneys. We can structure it as a settlement. You keep the house and a generous sum, and we all move forward without courts or police. No need for things to get ugly. Across the desk, Agent Martinez scribbled something on a yellow notepad and slid it to Margaret. Say yes. Let's set the meeting. Margaret swallowed, forcing calm into her voice. All right, come to the house tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock. We'll discuss it. When she hung up, her hands were trembling, but not from fear, from anticipation. The next night, the living room didn't look like her home. Agents had been through earlier, installing discreet recording devices, setting up surveillance in unmarked cars down the street. The coffee table was bare except for a neat stack of papers decoys meant to look like financial documents. And under Margaret's blouse, taped just beneath her collarbone, was a wire. She touched it once, uncertain. What if they notice? Agent Martinez shook her head. They won't. They'll be too busy trying to manipulate you. All you need to do is stay calm and let them talk. The more they say, the stronger our case. Margaret nodded. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She wasn't a spy, wasn't an actress. She was a widow who had spent her life ironing shirts and tending gardens, and yet tonight she was bait in a federal sting. At precisely 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Emily swept inside first, her hair pulled into a perfect chignon, her pearl earrings gleaming. She looked thinner, sharper, as though the last week had carved away the softness she used to wear like armor. David followed, briefcase in hand, his suit pressed but his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Mom," Emily said brightly, too brightly, "you look, well." Margaret gestured to the sofa. "Sit, let's get to the point." They sat, David snapping open the briefcase with practiced efficiency. Inside were folders, neatly stacked. He slid one across the table. "This is the agreement. You'll retain the house and $5 million in assets. In return, you'll withdraw all claims, release any allegations of fraud, and allow us to manage the estate quietly." Margaret stared at the papers. Her heart hammered, but her face betrayed nothing. "And if I don't sign?" Emily leaned forward, her smile brittle. "Then everyone loses. The courts, the media, the banks. It will be ugly, Mom." "Don't you want peace?" For the first time, Margaret truly looked at her daughter, not as the child she had rocked to sleep, not as the teenager she had cheered for at graduation, but as the woman sitting in her living room, trying to buy her silence with stolen money, and she felt nothing but clarity. "You call this peace?" she asked softly. "Forging wills? Throwing me out of my home? Telling me to find somewhere else to die?" Emily's face flickered, guilt warring with defiance. "I was under stress." "No!" Margaret cut her off, her voice sharp now, cutting through the air like glass. "You were under greed." David shifted uncomfortably. "Margaret, let's not get emotional. This is business." Margaret's lips curled into the faintest smile. "You're right. It is business." And right on cue, the front door opened. 2 FBI agents stepped inside, badges glinting, voices firm. "Emily Hayes Parker and David Parker, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. Please stand." For a heartbeat, the room froze. Emily's eyes went wide, her mouth opening in a silent gasp. "What? No, you can't!" David leapt to his feet, the briefcase clattering to the floor. "This is a mistake. We were negotiating." Agent Martinez entered behind them, her calm authority filling the room. "Yes, we know, and we recorded every word. Thank you for confirming your intentions." Handcuffs clicked. Emily's wrists were pulled behind her, the pearls at her ears catching the light as she twisted, desperate. "Mom, stop them! Tell them this isn't what you wanted." Margaret sat still, her hands folded in her lap. She looked her daughter in the eye, and for the first time there was no hesitation, no fear, only truth. "What I wanted," she said quietly, "was a family. What you gave me was betrayal. Now you'll have to live with your choices." Emily's face crumpled, half fury, half despair. David shouted something about lawyers, about mistakes, but the agents were already guiding them toward the door. The house fell silent again, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Margaret sat back against the sofa, exhaling slowly. Her blouse itched where the wire was taped, but she didn't move. She had done it. She had walked through the fire of her daughter's betrayal, through humiliation, poverty, and fear, and now she had emerged not as a victim, but as the one holding the board. The pawn had become the queen, and the queen had just delivered checkmate. The first night Margaret slept in the master bedroom again, the silence felt different. For weeks, silence had been her enemy, an echo of loneliness, a reminder of abandonment. But now, as moonlight streamed through the curtains and painted silver lines across the hardwood floor, the silence wrapped around her like a cloak. It was no longer emptiness, it was ownership. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling Daniel had chosen when they remodeled the house 20 years ago. But this time, she didn't see it as his. For the first time in 43 years, she looked at every corner of the house and thought, "Mine." The next morning, Margaret walked through each room slowly, deliberately. She touched the banister she had polished countless times, The kitchen counter where she'd chopped vegetables while Daniel read the newspaper, the fireplace mantel lined with photographs. All of it had once been curated for others, her husband, her daughter, her family's image. But today, she didn't ask what Daniel would want. She didn't wonder if Emily would approve. She asked only herself. In Daniel's old study, the air smelled of tobacco and leather, though he hadn't smoked in years. The heavy oak desk still dominated the space, covered in ledgers and meticulously organized files. His chair, worn smooth from decades of use, sat pushed against the wall, as if waiting for him to return. Margaret stood in the doorway, her shoebox of photographs tucked under her arm, and felt a strange mix of grief and freedom. This had been Daniel's sanctuary, the place where he plotted strategies and made decisions. For years, she had barely entered without permission. Now she stepped inside and placed her hand flat on the desk. "Thank you," she whispered. "But this room belongs to me now." It took her 2 days to clear it. The files went to Richard for safekeeping, the desk was donated, and the leather chair carried out by 2 men from the Goodwill truck. Margaret kept only one thing, a small brass lamp with a green shade that had always reminded her of the libraries she once dreamed of studying in. In their place, she brought in something new, or rather, something old rediscovered. From the attic came the easel Daniel had given her when they were first married. It was dusty, the wood warped slightly from years of neglect, but when she unfolded it and set it by the window, it felt like greeting a long-lost friend. She bought fresh canvases from the art supply store downtown, along with brushes and oils that smelled exactly as she remembered. The first time she pressed a brush to canvas, her hand trembled. The colors bled clumsily at first, lines crooked, as if decades of silence weighed on her wrist. But with each stroke, the hesitation loosened. Blue spread into skies, green melted into trees, gold flickered like sunlight across the canvas. She painted until her shoulders ached and her eyes blurred with tears not of sorrow this time, but of release. For years, Margaret had told herself she didn't need this, that cooking meals, folding laundry, and keeping peace at the dinner table were enough, that art was indulgence, a dream better left behind. But as the canvas came alive, she realized the truth. Denying herself had never been noble, it had been erasure, and she was done erasing herself. Each morning after, she rose with purpose. Coffee in her favorite mug, sunlight spilling into the new studio, brush in hand. Neighbors passing by would sometimes see her through the window, head tilted, brow furrowed, completely absorbed in color and light. They no longer saw a widow clinging to the past. They saw a woman beginning again. One afternoon, Richard stopped by to deliver updates on the legal proceedings. He paused in the doorway of the study. No, the studio now, and smiled. Daniel would be proud. Margaret set down her brush and wiped her hands on a rag. For the first time, I'm not sure that matters. I'm proud. That's enough. Her words surprised even her, but as she said them, she felt their truth settle deep inside her bones. The transformation wasn't in the walls of the house or the zeros in her bank account. It was in her posture, in her voice, in the way she looked at her reflection without flinching. She was no longer the mother dismissed as useless. She was no longer the wife who measured her worth by sacrifice. She was Margaret Hayes, painter, homeowner, survivor, and now, creator of her own life. Late one evening, she finished a self-portrait. On the canvas stood a woman with gray hair pulled back loosely, her eyes lined with years but fierce with new light. The background was not a kitchen or a nursery, but a blaze of color blues, reds, and golds swirling like fire. She studied the painting, her chest swelling with something she hadn't felt in years: pride. For so long, she had been told what she wasn't: not savvy enough, not strong enough, not independent enough. But the woman staring back from the canvas was proof of what she had always been, buried beneath duty and silence. Not a pawn, a queen. And this time, the board was hers alone. The weeks after Emily and David's arrest passed in a blur of paperwork, hearings, and reporters camped outside the house on Willow Lane. For years, Margaret Hayes had lived as though she were invisible, her life measured by meals cooked, floors scrubbed, and sacrifices unspoken. Now, for the first time, the world was looking directly at her. At first, she resisted. She avoided the phone calls from journalists, declined interviews, and shut the curtains when camera crews idled outside. She told herself it was all too much, that her grief was still too raw, that she was simply a widow trying to survive. But the letters began to arrive, dozens at first, then hundreds. Handwritten notes from elderly women across the country, emails from men in nursing homes whose children had drained their accounts, stories from strangers who whispered the same truth. It happened to me too, and no one listened. Margaret read every word. Each letter lit a fire inside her. She realized her story was not just hers, it was theirs. And if she stayed silent, the cycle would continue, so she said yes. She founded the Elder Protection Foundation, pouring $15 million of her inheritance into legal aid programs, hotlines, and shelters for seniors facing financial abuse. She hired advocates and attorneys who specialized in cases where children preyed upon their aging parents. What had begun as Margaret's personal war transformed into a movement. The media seized on it. CNN called her the grandmother who fought back. A New York Times profile declared her a symbol of resilience in an era of elder exploitation. And when Netflix proposed a limited documentary series, Margaret surprised even herself by agreeing. "I don't care if they tell the story of my humiliation," she told Richard and Agent Martinez, "as long as they also tell the story of what came after." But her true test didn't come in front of cameras. It came on a cold October morning when she stood backstage at a senior advocacy conference in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of people filled the ballroom, the air buzzing with quiet anticipation. Some leaned on canes, others rolled in wheelchairs, but their eyes all shone with the same hunger for hope, for justice, for someone to say what they had never dared. Margaret's palms were damp. She had painted canvases, faced her daughter's betrayal, worn a wire for the FBI, but this was different. This was speaking not just for herself, but for every voice that had been silenced. The announcer's voice boomed. "Please welcome survivor and founder of the Elder Protection Foundation, Mrs. Margaret Hayes." Applause erupted. She stepped onto the stage, the spotlight blinding for a moment. She gripped the podium, steadying herself, and looked out at the sea of faces. Gray hair, lined cheeks, weary eyes, and behind them, stories just like hers. She took a breath. "I am not here because I am extraordinary," she began. Her voice trembled, but grew stronger with each word. "I am here because I was betrayed, by the very people I loved and trusted. And I know I am not the only one." A ripple of murmurs swept the crowd, soft gasps, nods of recognition. "For years, I believed family was everything, that blood was unbreakable. But blood does not guarantee loyalty. DNA does not guarantee love." She paused, her chest tightening. She thought of Emily, of the night on the porch, of the words that had cut her deepest. Her voice sharpened, steady and fierce. "Family is not the people who share your genes. Family is the people who protect you when you are most vulnerable. Family is the ones who stand beside you, not the ones who strip you of your dignity." The room erupted in applause, loud, sustained, rising to cheers. Some in the audience wiped tears from their eyes. Others pumped their fists in agreement. Margaret felt the sound wash over her, not as noise, but as affirmation. She wasn't just speaking, she was channeling their collective pain, their unspoken truths. She leaned forward, gripping the podium tighter. "We have been quiet too long. We have been dismissed as burdens, as useless, as relics. But we are none of those things. We are the keepers of stories, the builders of homes, the ones who carry generations on our backs. And we deserve protection, respect, and justice." For a moment, she let the silence settle again, the audience hanging on her words. Then she delivered the line that would be quoted in headlines the next day, etched into the memory of everyone in that ballroom. "Family is not DNA. Family is the people who protect you." The applause this time was thunderous, echoing off the ballroom walls. Margaret's throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes, but she did not look away. She stood tall, owning the stage the way she now owned her life. In that moment, she was no longer the widow who had been thrown out of her house, no longer the mother discarded with 2 suitcases and $200. She was Margaret Hayes, survivor, advocate, and voice for the forgotten. And she knew this was only the beginning. The letters came every month, each one written in Emily's familiar hand. From the prison where she now served her sentence, Margaret's daughter tried again and again to stitch together what she had so violently torn apart. The first letters were defensive half-apologies laced with excuses. "I was under pressure, Mom. You don't know how much stress I was in." The next few dripped with desperation. "Think about the grandchildren. Don't let them grow up without me." And then, slowly, the words shifted. "I am sorry. I see now how wrong I was. Please forgive me." Margaret read the first 3. The 4th she left unopened on the kitchen counter for days before slipping it into the shoebox where she had once kept her photographs. By the time the 10th arrived, she no longer bothered to open them at all. It wasn't that she was incapable of forgiveness. Margaret had forgiven many things in her life. Daniel's stubbornness, Emily's sharp tongue as a teenager, her own quiet tendency to erase herself. But forgiveness, she realized, did not mean forgetting. And it did not mean rebuilding what had been shattered beyond repair. She told Richard once over tea, "Forgiveness is for me, forgetting would be for her, and I will not forget." Her voice had carried no anger when she said it, only clarity. The house had changed in the months since her rebirth. The floral curtains were gone, replaced by airy linen that let the light pour in. The kitchen gleamed with countertops she had chosen for herself, not Daniel. The study was no longer a graveyard of old ledgers, but a living, breathing studio where canvases leaned against the walls, spilling color into every corner. One canvas stood on the easel now, nearly complete. It was a portrait, but not of Emily or Daniel or anyone who had once defined her life. It was a woman standing in sunlight, her hair silver but radiant, her eyes alive with purpose. The brushstrokes captured strength in the set of her jaw, softness in the curve of her smile, and fire in the light across her face. Margaret stepped back, brush in hand, and studied the woman on the canvas. At first glance, it looked nothing like the widow who had once sat in a dingy motel room, clutching a shoebox of photographs. And yet, it was her, perhaps the truest version of her that had ever existed. Outside, the afternoon sun slipped lower, pouring through the studio window, igniting the painted figure so that it seemed almost alive. Margaret's chest swelled, not with pride exactly, but with recognition. She had found herself again not the obedient wife, not the discarded mother, but the woman who had always existed beneath the layers of silence and sacrifice. Her phone buzzed on the table. Another letter had arrived at the lawyer's office from Emily, Richard's message said. Margaret ignored it. She dipped her brush into gold paint instead, adding the final highlight to the woman's cheekbone, capturing the glow of sunlight. She whispered into the quiet, not to Emily, not even to Daniel, but to herself. "This is who I was always meant to be." The world outside would go on talking about the scandal, about the arrests, about the foundation she had built. Reporters would spin her story into headlines. Netflix would shape it into scenes. Emily would keep writing letters. David would keep filing appeals. Life would go on in all its noise. But here, in this room, Margaret had discovered the only revenge worth having. Not revenge that destroyed, but revenge that created. Not revenge that clawed at the past, but revenge that built a future. The greatest revenge was not to ruin her enemies. It was to become everything they had never believed she could be. Margaret set down the brush, wiped her hands, and stepped back from the easel. The woman in the painting gazed out from the canvas, bathed in sunlight, unafraid and unbroken. She smiled, and for the first time in decades, the smile felt like freedom. Life has a way of testing us in ways we never imagined. Margaret's story is not only about betrayal and loss, it is about rediscovery, resilience, and the power of refusing to be erased. She began as a woman discarded by her own daughter, stripped of dignity and home, forced to question everything she believed about family. But what could have been her ending became her beginning. Through grief, through deception, through the cold silence of a motel room, she found the strength to rise. she discovered that her worth was never defined by how others treated her, but by how she chose to see herself. And in the end, she learned the most profound truth of all. True revenge isn't destroying those who wronged you, it's becoming everything they never believed you could be. That lesson is not just Margaret's. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt invisible, anyone who has ever been told they were useless, anyone who has been betrayed by the very people they love the most. It belongs to all of us who carry scars hidden beneath our smiles and yet still rise again and again. Now, I want to turn this moment toward you. What is your story? Have you ever faced something that felt like the end, only to discover it was the beginning of a new chapter? Maybe you haven't spoken it out loud yet. Maybe you've carried it quietly, tucked away where no one else can see. But here, in this community, your story matters, your voice matters. So I invite you share it. Write your story in the comments below. Speak it, even if your voice trembles, because sometimes the act of telling is the first step toward healing. And you never know who else might read it and feel less alone. If this story touched your heart, if you found even a small piece of yourself reflected in Margaret's journey, I ask you to take a moment. Like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to this channel. That way, you'll be among the first to hear the next stories that remind us we are stronger than we realize, stories that connect us across distance and time, stories that prove it's never too late to reclaim your life. Thank you for being here, for listening, for allowing this story to live in you. Until the next chapter, stay strong, stay true, and never forget, your story is worth telling.